Homeostasis is a balancing act where the body is taking cues and trying to maintain a condition of equilibrium. Not that nothing's changing. Things can change. Things often will change as we eat more, expend energy, move from a hot to cold environment. But the idea is that homeostasis is going to help counter those disturbances. So what are some of the important things that homeostasis is looking for? One of the important requirements of a living thing is to obtain and use energy. So let's talk about metabolism. This is the sum of all chemical energy processes. So this is energy that you are consuming and energy that you are using. So we're just going to further define metabolism as anabolic or catabolic. Anabolism refers to the consumption of energy. So you're using energy here to build something bigger. Catabolism is when you're releasing energy. You are breaking things down and providing energy. A good way to remember this is Annapolis is a really big city, and building a large city requires lots of small building blocks and energy and resources to create that structure. Catabolism sounds a lot like catastrophe. Hurricane Katrina was a catastrophe that decimated hospitals, schools, and buildings, resulting in small debris like 2x4s, rubble, and nails. When we talk about obtaining and using energy, it's important to point out the energy molecule, adenosine triphosphate, or ATP for short. It gets its name because it is an adenosine attached to a sugar and 3 phosphates. Is that the energy is stored in that third phosphate bond. So the bond connecting phosphates 2 and 3 together. And when that phosphate breaks off, a lot of energy is released. And now that leaves us an adenosine diphosphate. It only has 2 phosphates, which is super eager to bond to another phosphate again to restore its balance. And so what we end up seeing is this rapid conversion between adenosine diphosphate and adenosine triphosphate in a very continuous process. Living things have to be able to respond to stimuli in the outside world. So let's take a moment to recognize the players in a signal pathway. There's a stimulus. This is some sort of signal. It could be hot, it could be cold, it could be painful. It's an internal or external cue. The receptor is the cell or molecule that can recognize that signal. Transduction is the term for how we propagate that signal, pass it on, and then the response is our end goal. How are we going to change the situation to correct this error? So a couple things to recognize when we talk about responding to the outside world. There's an afferent and an efferent pathway. So just like our roads have different directions that you can drive on to minimize crashes and conflicting signals, so too does our nervous system have separate pathways to ensure that signals can travel unimpeded to either the brain or the end goal. So things to recognize. Afferent pathway is going to the brain. After the signal, what are you going to do? Tell the brain. The efferent pathway is the effect. What's the brain going to tell you to do? Your hand touches a hot pot. The afferent pathway is going to tell the brain it's hot. The efferent pathway is the brain telling your hand, move, let go. And there are feedback systems built into this information flow to ensure that that signal is addressed for however long it's present. A negative feedback does not favor the stimulus, so it's going to try to negate or decrease the stimulus. It's going to try to undo it. Okay, so a good example of negative feedback is you eat a huge meal of ice cream, chocolate fudge, and sprinkles, and that's a lot of sugar in your bloodstream. Negative feedback would have more insulin made to help the uptake of that glucose. Positive feedback, on the other hand, reinforces and strengthens that change, encouraging more and more and more of that message and signal. A good example of positive feedback is in the process of labor and delivery, you get a signal to push and that there's pressure of the baby emerging out the vaginal canal. And as you push, baby becomes more engaged and you push some more. And so those contractions continue to build, getting harder and harder and more painful and existing longer in shorter intervals of time, amplifying that stimulus to help you get the baby out. And then once the baby's no longer in, there's no signal to reinforce at that point and it stops. All life on our planet, whether it's a banana or a human or a cat, evolved on Earth and as such are subjected to a similar range of conditions because environment really does dictate a lot about evolution and natural selection. And so we see a lot of similarities across life forms. When these needs are met, the individual responds to the environment well, and so we see homeostasis and survival and success rates increase. If these needs are unmet, the individual affected may not have rapid contact with the environment or reality, and that can lead to problems. They may not necessarily die, but it might diminish their functionality and overall health. We're going to talk about the main requirements. For an element to be essential, we have to, 1, know exactly what it does. 2, we have to know that there's no replacement for it. And 3, if we remove that element, it results in death. That is the criteria of something to be an essential element. Water is a critical element. Its form must be liquid. Okay, water can exist as a solid, liquid, or a gas, but only the liquid water is accessible to humans. So that's an important thing to note. The significance of water, why we should care, is because water is a universal solvent. And what that means is water can dissolve almost anything. And so it's in this liquid space that chemical reactions can occur. Bonds can make and be broken, and the elements can move within it, floating freely, and therefore come into contact with and combine. Oxygen is an essential element of life. The form here is it's gaseous, and the significance of oxygen is it is critical to our aerobic respiration, which is how we produce energy. Okay? This brings us to energy. 2 important forms of energy is solar energy and chemical energy. And the idea here is that energy can be converted between these systems. Plants can obtain energy from the sun, and if we eat plants or if we eat animals that eat plants, we can piggyback off the energy that they've gained. In many chemical reactions, energy is required to form bonds, and so we have to have an input of energy to afford this. Energy is kind of like a currency, a way of us purchasing upgrades to the body. So there are nutrients that we describe as being essential. Some really important ones are hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen. They make up about 95% of all living things on our planet. So the form are individual elements, and the significance here is that they are the building blocks of life, that they build the cells. Coming to the end here, temperature is an essential element of life, not in a chemical element sense, but an essential attribute for life. The ideal temperature is going to be somewhere between 20 and 40 degrees Celsius. It's a pretty narrow range. And the reason for that is because that's the range in which water will stay liquid. And our reliance upon liquid water is so profound. And we could go about 30 days without energy, without eating food, without nutrients, but we'd be hard pressed to survive 3 days without water. Temperature can also lead to the breakdown of bonds, the process called denaturation. So that's one of the reasons why we worry about fevers or extreme heat scenarios. Salt to water ratio. It's important to recognize that the ratio, the ideal here is 0.9% of sodium chloride or NaCl. This equates to about a teaspoon of salt a day. That's it. Why is this important? It's the salt in our bloodstream and in our water and all of our other fluids that maintains our blood vessels from collapsing in on themselves. One of the big things that determines how much urine we create is based upon the salt concentration in our body and that salt to water ratio. And then it also will retain water as needed as well. In terms of pressure, I just want you to recognize that there's 3 forms. This is not necessary for an exam in our class. This is just here to provide you a comprehensive study guide as you move forward. You'll utilize this when we talk about the circulatory system in anatomy and physiology. But for now, it's the atmospheric pressure, the intrapulmonary pressure, and the intrapleural pressure. And the big significance of these forms is that it's the differences between these that ultimately govern your ability to inhale or exhale and how much your lungs can move. The last thing is pH. We'll talk about this more when we talk about living chemistry, but the most critical pH is that of our blood, very narrow window, 7.35 to 7.45. And why does pH matter? Ultimately, pH contributes to the environment of the body, which has a huge impact on enzyme functionality and can lead to denaturation. Now, our body is quite amazing And it's constantly looking at these thresholds. There are set points of what is acceptable for pH, or what is acceptable for oxygen, or what is acceptable for the temperature. And when signals come in that say we're moving away from that set point, the body can go through a process called acclimatization to either train for this new condition if it's going to be long term, or adjust to compensate for it.